Why exactly does free speech matter? I'm Marco Perry. Welcome to the Perry Platform. Public conversation around topics like free speech have gone completely off the rails once again. So I thought it was fitting to revisit that topic but with a twist. A bit of a disclaimer too, actually. I don't have much of a show note prepared for this conversation. And that's intentional. I want to have an organic talk with you guys, starting at first principles and seeing if we can find our way through the haze here. So, this might not be as polished as what you're used to, but it will give us an opportunity to just think through the basic arguments here, to really get down to why something like free speech matters, and if it does matter, presumably we can arrive at why without the need for extensive planning. It should arise organically. So, free speech, fundamentally it has two components, free and speech. Let's start with speech. What is that exactly? Well, it boils down to words. And what are words for? What's the value of this? Evolutionarily, what is the benefit that was accruing to humans to even develop something like that? Well, I've come to the conclusion that words are fundamentally a means of sense-making. In fact, they're a more profound mechanism of such a thing. So, something like vision is also a mechanism of sense-making. You can look at your environment and derive facts from that. But words are interpersonal. It allows me to communicate to you my process of sense-making and to compare it with yours. And we start to leverage network effects here. Because now, it's not just my sole perspective. It's in conjunction with yours in the community, maybe an entire country, maybe an entire world. The fact of the matter is, things are complicated. There are so many facets of life, and no one person can analyze every crevice of that. There are going to be perspectives and details that you're not going to pick up on that somebody else might. Words are the way we bridge that gap. I don't have to have lived in the 16th century to know what it's like to have done that. Why? Because words can convey that experience to me. I don't have to have gone through a particular disease to know what it's like to have experienced it, because words can convey that to you. I don't have to be a pilot to know when something is going wrong on a plane, because once again, words can convey that to you. When the pilot is swearing and looking nervous, you know something's off. Now, words can be verbal, like a conversation, or they can be written down, like in that of a book or an essay or even a blog post. Words allow you to tap into knowledge and insights that you would have never come across on your own. They allow humanity to compound learning. They allow us to move forward, and it decentralizes power. It's not just an individual or one entity who create a narrative and everyone abides by it. You can use your words to interact with it and change it, destroy it, or replace it as the populace sees fit. This is only possible, though, if we have the free element in free speech. I believe everyone should have an undisturbed access to this tool, to words, because they're the best thing that we have. And that's not to say that there is no downside. Almost instantly, you can come up with an example of where having something like free speech was detrimental. But conversely, I can think of many more examples where having it was beneficial. You can look at the world today and see a country where there is nothing, no concept of free speech. And look at the well-being of the citizenry there. And look at what they're subjected to. Grand narratives that cannot be questioned without fear of imprisonment or death. And you have that type of thing religiously, like in some countries, and you have that thing politically in others. There is not a utopian answer here. And there isn't a path forward on the spectrum of speech and authoritarianism, free speech and authoritarianism, that produces an outcome with no drawbacks. So you have to pick the drawbacks that are most palatable to you. And I think when you stack the chips, it's obvious on which side that's going to be. A community that can rely on the insights of each node in that network is going to produce a more robust, healthier, and stronger information system than a community that's relying on an authority figure to tell you exactly what you must believe in. Ideas become outdated very quickly. Without the mechanism of free speech to update that, you're going to find yourself in a dystopia quite quick. Of course, you'll have the occasional fool who spews insane ideas that infect a subset of the population, but rather that than have insane ideas infect everyone under threat of force. And if that's not happening in a current authoritarian system, it's bound to. Because when you centralize power, even if the one holding that power now you feel is trustworthy, that's not going to persist long into the future. Because people die off and they're replaced. And eventually someone's going to become that authority figure who will abuse it. A decentralized approach limits the risk of tyranny and also provides us the benefits of being able to leverage each other's insights and let the best ideas surface. One analogy you can compare this to is that of driving. Now, we know something like having a high speed limit is dangerous. It results in people dying when they have an impact. But you're able to get to the places that you have to get to in a reasonable amount of time. And the odds of an impact are quite low, and they're not something that will destroy an entire country, typically. So, given this circumstance, the citizenry, the populace, has admitted to themselves that there is a certain amount of risk that justifies the rewards here. If we wanted a solution with no risk and all the rewards, you'd be hard-strapped to come up with something like that. On one hand, we can theoretically reduce speed limits to 5 kilometers an hour everywhere. Highways, side streets, main roads, that's it. We would bring the amount of motor vehicle deaths in this country pretty close to zero. Because any impacts at 5 kilometers an hour, they probably wouldn't produce a life-ending situation. Now, the downside though is that you cripple the infrastructure. People can't get to where they have to go. People are not able to transport themselves to places like work, to visit family, to go to school, whatever it's going to be. And the idea of having a place to go that's even a couple kilometers away now becomes a daunting task. So you compare those and you take in the risk associated with driving at something like a reasonable speed limit. Free speech works in a similar way, where there is no perfect answer here. There is going to be a drawback regardless of where you land on the spectrum of accepting it or not. But when you compare the pros and the cons, it's very obvious that something like free speech is more beneficial than not. If you aren't on board with this idea yet, let me put another fact into play here. When there is disagreements among people, or groups, or entities, there actually is only 2 ways to resolve it. You can either talk about it, or you can engage in violence. That's it. The 2 ways that humans have for solving problems. If somebody is saying something that you find distasteful and it has impacts to you, you can converse with them. You can debate. You can try and change their idea. You can come to a middle ground. But if that option is removed from the table, if that option is only enabled due to something like free speech, if that's gone, what else can you do? If you can't talk about things, well, you'll have to do something physically about it. If it's a problem to you, the problem is going to persist now unless you take action. That's a recipe for civil disaster. People need a way to air their grievances in a healthy manner, and free speech enables that. We're not thinking about the consequences of removing that outlet, of removing that mechanism of engaging with words. Because now instead of fighting a battle of words verbally, there's going to be a battle emerging violently, physically. And people will do that if they feel like they can't get their opinions across. Now, given all of that, founders of countries, they theorized that it would be important to protect the populace from government tyranny. Of Western countries, typically, you'd find a rule like that, promising you that the government would have no hand in altering what you can and cannot say. And of course, there are some reasonable caveats to that. You can't just be yelling fire in a theater. You can't be threatening people, slander, and libel are illegal. And that all makes sense, but aside from the realm of these reasonable caveats that we've enacted, the government's not going to interfere with the process of free speech, but this has become an outdated notion. When these rules were enacted, social media wasn't around. The dynamics of market ideas and central authority was simply people versus government. The government was the only actor that could institute a central authority here. And the market of ideas was for the populace. But now, people, using technology, have created their own authority circles. Information moves very fast and everyone has a platform. The government is not the only entity that can establish a tyranny over words, and we have to talk about if that's a problem. If we didn't want the government to do something like that, is it reasonable to not want an activist group, for example, to also be doing something like that? Is free speech a high enough priority to protect from every threat? Threats that have emerged since the dawn of this conversation. Threats that weren't around when the laws were established. And perhaps don't even need laws to protect free speech. It could be societal norms and customs. For the populace to view people trying to stop that process in a negative light versus cheering them on. It feels as though we've enacted a form of mob rule here, where mob rule is determining what is acceptable speech and what is not. There's a handful of fallacies that come with that. First of all, we assume that the majority is always right, where there are many examples to prove otherwise. So handing or what even might just be a seeming majority, a voice that is so loud it's encapsulating and blocking out what might be a silent majority, and handing them disproportionate power. Is that a good idea? Further, there are other concepts to think about here, such as once something like that is established, what happens when the loudest voices become ones that you don't agree with anymore? What happens when those loud voices morph into an abomination? You may really like what they're saying now, but take things back to their first principles. Do we think that it's a good idea to have something like the control of the words that one can utter at the mercy of mobs? Because that mob could very easily flip the script or become too extreme in one direction or the other. And then what do? Well, why even arm them with that weaponry to begin with? Why not simply make a stand based on those first principles and say, this is unacceptable? Have discourse, have discussions, reason things out. In a nutshell, act like a mature individual. But don't start hating people. Don't start demonizing those who think differently. Don't start calling for things like violence and acting in ways that reflect the hyperbole you view it as. Also, have some humility. Why would you assume that you know the perfect answer to everything within a domain? There's always room for nuance, and maybe you are right. Still, there's benefit to hearing ideas regardless of them being good or bad. If an idea is bad, well, it helps you strengthen your own. Because now your position is fortified. You're able to fend off that bad idea. You're able to conquer it. And if you make that process public, well, that maps onto everyone else's learning. They'll see the flaws in the illogical argument, and it will be equivalent to a vanishing act. Now, some fringe people will always hold on to certain concepts, but the more you can rely on logic and the shared game of good discourse and conversation, the better you'll be positioned. And if it's a good idea that comes your way, maybe your old conceptions get demolished, but that's a positive thing. Because now you don't have to spend any more time being wrong or half wrong or whatever it is. You can get a better idea and move towards a truth. What is there to be afraid about then? Well, I can think of one example why somebody would not want to engage in that free speech process. If you're saying something that you know to be shaky, but the power it grants you is intoxicating, being able to scream that one thing is this or it's some type of example of that, without having to engage with rational debate and discussion, puts you in a powerful position. Because you can't be wrong, you're infallible at that point. Here, the intentions of those individuals who act in those ways becomes quite clear. They're not concerned with acting maturely. They're not concerned with honor. They're not concerned with the truth. They're simply concerned with pushing a narrative regardless of the truth of it. And they will very eagerly confuse you, mislead you, and take away your voice if it gives them the ability to remain in that powerful position. And here, intent is also something that's interesting to think about in light of things like the Joe Rogan controversy. There are differences in the ways in which people act. Bad ideas and good ideas are the outcome, but you can arrive at them in quite different ways. For example, you have to distinguish between somebody like Alex Jones and somebody like Joe Rogan. On one hand, somebody who is just spewing conspiracy theories for kicks. Somebody who is quite close to being considered crazy. Somebody who is doing this for the sake of chaos. Then you have somebody who is simply just having conversations, and sometimes the ideas that come out of it are wrong, but they're not seeking those outcomes per se. They're talking about complex topics and hoping to achieve insight for not only them, but the listeners of that podcast. Is that a bad thing? No. So although sometimes the outcomes could be considered bad, we must also take into account the intent here. If you don't consider intent, you're casting a far too wide net. Intent is giving you an idea of what that person will do next. Take, for example, somebody who hits you with their car. Let's say the individual wanted to do that. They wanted to kill you. And then in another case, a family member backs up into you because they didn't see you, and they rush you to the hospital, and they're crying, and they're very sorry. The outcome is the same here. You've been hit by a car. You're going to the hospital. But the intent of the actors matters. And it actually is the only thing that matters here. Because it tells you how you should act in the future. Are they worthy of forgiveness? Or are they a real threat to you? Think about that. And while you're trying to juggle that, another thing to consider is how we can act maturely in a civilized society. This is how we hold countries like Canada and America together. Once civil discourse is gone, as I've talked about, what's the other outcome? Becomes violence, and we don't need that. So, how should somebody with honor and maturity handle disagreements and viewpoints that they don't like? Should they resort to canceling you? Should they resort to demonizing you? Should they resort to extreme measures, tarring and feathering? Or should they simply take these ideas, remove the personal, and engage with the ideas in a healthy manner? Trying to put forward ideas and arguments against the ideas they don't like. Having that discussion. Convincing people through facts and logic and reasoning to switch sides. Or should they continue to persist with threats, demonization, demagoguery, and all the other nonsense that we've seen become commonplace today? It seems to me that the unhealthy acts and paths that we've put ourselves on come as a result of the ways in which we view those who disagree with us, or those who have differing opinions, or those who may say things that hurt our feelings. They're being viewed as demons. They're being viewed as things to exercise, as enemies. But let's say we shifted that perspective and just view them as fellow country people with just that. Different ideas. But we do have something in common. Wanting to make this country the best it can be. And if we start to presume that as the bedrock idea of everyone we engage with, we'd be far better off. And of course, you can have dumb ideas built on top of that. Your vision for a future that you define as the best could be very different than mine. But once we presume that bedrock, we can have healthy discussions because we know we're trying to, at least conceptually, get to this shared vision. But there are people who view individuals with other ideas as trying to do the opposite, trying to destroy this country. And we know that that's most likely untrue. Very few people actually think that way. Very few people view themselves as a villain. And that's why when you cast them as one, you get adverse reactions. It's unfortunate, but I've come to the conclusion that we're not acting as a serious country. We're not acting as world leaders. We're acting like children across the board, honestly, and it's a shame. From politicians to activists to university professors, the whole swath of them. It's rare to find someone with integrity. It's rare to find someone who can uphold traditional liberal values. It's rare to find someone who's trying to mend the wounds we've suffered versus someone who's just making it worse. There has to be a notion of camaraderie that's part of the equation here. How do we move forward as a country? Not how do we move forward as balkanized, hostile groups who are wrapped up in identity politics, who are trying to play the victim Olympics. Why would we conceptualize ourselves in these terms? There is far more to you than the arbitrary characteristics of your birth. There is far more to you than the chromosome pairing that resulted in your gender. There is far more to you than the pigmentation of your skin. You're an individual, so start acting like it. And it doesn't mean that there are no group concerns or problems, but what is your bedrock conception of yourself here? Is it you as the individual or you as the group member? And the ways in which you answer that is going to impact the ways in which you're viewing the world. This is a major consideration that has to be fleshed out in a multicultural society. Diversity can be a strength if it's positioned as one, and it can be a problem if there are wedges between all the different groups here. Ask yourself this: has there been a mending, a growing together as of late? Or has there been a widening of the gap? Has there been a wedge that's continually being hammered into the different quote-unquote factions that you can see in a society? Why not have a bedrock of Canadian? Why not have a bedrock of presuming at least some good intentions on behalf of those you disagree with? Why not have a bedrock of letting people say what they want and then combating those ideas in the realm of speech? Why push people towards things like violence? Why push people towards things like villainy? These are unhealthy dynamics, and once again, I just have to refer back to what I said before. It's very easy to view our current situation as one run by children. I can't be the only one who is shaking my head almost every day when I see news stories that just reek of immaturity, and perhaps a symbol of the privilege that everyone has in Canada, that we can spend time bickering about madness because we've eliminated most of the fundamental challenges that humanity has had to deal with for centuries and the vast majority of our existence. We are simply not in a healthy place right now, and whether it's due to boredom or due to really consequential changes in our public discourse and societal philosophy, we have to figure this out. It should be clear to everyone that a balkanization and a destruction of social cohesion is not going to do any good for anyone. Simply ask yourself the question, what is the healthy path forward for all of us? And that includes people who agree with you and those who don't agree with you, people whose ideas you like and those you detest. How, as a country, can we move forward and then act according to that vision? So that about does it for today's conversation. If you enjoyed the material, be sure to leave a review and share. Especially with this, I believe it's worth sharing to get the conversation that extra kick that it might need. I'll see you soon.